Well, hello there. My name is Marta. I'm a game designer and game developer for the past 15 years, and my main interest always has been deconstructing and putting into the higher level of abstraction things as I am a system designer. And from this perspective, I'm going to approach this wonderful and very, how to say it, gleeful topic. But as being a Polish person, I think I have enough of war standing next to my door, so I will go from the perspective of games. And I would stand even further as ludic and play are key functions for us, but the same as stories. Stories are the things that first contextualize our consciousness, but also allow us to understand where we are and what we do. And to put those stories into, of course, more deconstructed and more abstract ways so we can analyze it, we can use one of the frameworks. This one actually suggested by Mr. York in the book. That one is Into the Woods. There are two books with the same name. I never remember which one. This is the Five-Act Journey. So what he proposes there is looking at stories in terms of opposing values. And those opposing values can be assigned from the highest level of a structure of a story, so from the main storyline, to the lowest one, to a single dialogue. A single dialogue is still operating on those values. Oh, wait, I have no idea. What? Yeah, that would make sense. Okay, the technology. No. Okay. So, getting back to it, so those opposing values can express in the whole level, in the totality of the highest level of a story, but also in a single dialogue. And those can be many, many different things. Wait. When you do that, can you press enter?
Sorry. The windows.
Uh, okay, nah, I'm fine, I can do it like that. So behind me, I hope so, you have different parts of such opposing forces. And it can be very many things. So truth versus safety. We can imagine this story, this kind of narrative beat playing out between a mother and a child, where the child wants to know the truth, what are the sounds outside of the window, and the mother wants to give the child even the basic notion of safety, not saying what it actually is, to not put fear. Oh, now we don't even. Yeah, but the other one, the truth and the lie, the loneliness and being part of the community. Those are the basic tensions that exist at the very basic of every story. And there's nothing more powerful. And of course, it is applied. No, we're perfectly fine. Everything is alive, everyone is perfect. And we can apply those things to any media, of course, any storytelling media, with a very, very broad definition of a storytelling media is going after Brian Upton approach that even static mediums are playful in a sense. But there's no more powerful narrative beat that is actually played to death, so to say, in any media than the life versus death. The life versus death beat is the one that captures our attention the strongest because it also encapsulates the most basic fear that we have, the fear of perishing, the one the biological engine beneath all of us. And of course, this life versus death kind of beat can be explored to the death of a nation, the death of an idea, the death of a religion when you put it in context of war. But in the end of the day, it is life versus death. It is survival versus perishing. And let's go from that death because I'm here to talk about games and this is my thing. So let's discuss death inside of the games because death is the ultimate motivator. the thing that get us out of bed outside of antidepressants every morning. And death is in the central part of games. Uh, Death has been from the very, very beginning. The notion of losing has been in many games connected to death one to one. Our character dies, our troops dies, all of those things die inside of the game world. But the question is, do they? The death in games is usually just how to say, an inconvenience, a bump on the road. It is not the end, it is just a punishment to start again and again and again from a probably a safe point, from a place that we already been, from the place that we started. Heck, in some games, the death itself is part of an enjoyment of the medium that we are using. This is the case with the Super Meat Boy game, the one that it's moving, that my head is exactly on, right? It's a very punishing platformer game in which the death of the main character is something to be celebrated, the death and rebirth in that cycle that is eventually, after a level is finished, presented to the player in form of a magnificent gift, putting all of the deaths in one. And what is interesting, at least I find interesting, you don't have to, is the fact that we want to tackle death in games. We want to tackle the actual weight of this dichotomy, the life versus death, when it's with its all of its consequences. So to put death in games, we use a special word, because as we know, death is just an annoyance. It's not the end of things in games. So we add the permadeath, the suffix of perma coming from permanently. So some games try to tackle that aspect in games with introduction of permadeath mechanics. Those mechanics usually work around the fact that your save game, your checkpoint, at the moment of your death is getting destroyed. There is no coming back. There is no loading the game. You have to still start all over. But this character, this crew, this ship, this story that you were building, that one is gone. But as you can see on those pictures here before, they look quite different than the God of War next to me, the God of War in the left upper corner. And it kind of points us to the forwards, the budget and the scope and the appeal of those games. All of those games that you can see here are indie games. Actually, the one behind me have a huge commercial success, but still, it's a very niche title, because in a humorous, I find it, way, players find death, a permadeath mechanic, too punishing. Death is not just, death is not fun, so to say. But on the other hand, it creates those stakes. It creates this tense moment, this play of, will I survive this or not? Still, the price, even in game, a time, is too much to pay. And as so, we have a genre that exists in between. We like to have not only death in games, which, as we already established, means nothing. We have permadeath, which already means quite a lot, but it's punishing and no one's like it. So we created a hybrid in between, a roguelike kind of game, where the character dies, but never in vain. There is no such a thing in roguelike games that the death does not bring you closer to its goal. And here the example would be Hades, a game where you constantly try to get out of Tartar, trying to escape your horrible father, the titular Hades. And each time you die, you start from the beginning. You lose many things, but the story on top of that, the relationship you have with your other characters, progress. So in games, there is no such a thing as death in vain. The death always brings us closer and closer to something, which find in the pictures of war and from the singular perspective, there's a little bit of problem, in my opinion, in there. But of course, Even if we are talking about permadeath games, even we are talking about the games that will remove your save file, there's always the option to start a new one, to start a new adventure, as this is that one Moloch that we cannot conquer inside of our medium, that one veil we cannot look and simulate behind. But there are games which try to tackle it in a stronger fashion, exploring how it feels to lose actually something. This is a game called The Graveyard. It was created by Tale of Tales artistic collective, so to say. In this game, the player is this lovely old lady, and the goal of the game, the experiencer, the hoising definition is getting constantly broken by the modern terms of games and what they do, and that goal and the clear state of win and lose is one of those things. But in this experience, the goal of the player is to go to the graveyard of the to the grave of the close ones, and to light a little lamp, remembering. Sometimes the character sings a song, sometimes says something, but that's all. And in the full version of the game, because this is the demo version, you can go, you can come back, you can go, you can come back. You launch it from time to time as a form of a meditative experience. And this is what the demo version offers, because the full version of the game differentiates only in one aspect. The grandma may die. When you go to the grave, one time, you don't know which one, the grandma will sit down and she will never get back up. And the thing is, this is a game which locks it. You cannot reinstall it. You cannot, of course, you can hack it, but whatever. The intended experience is you cannot reinstall it, you cannot load, you cannot save. Every time from that point, when you start the game, the graveyard is empty. The grandma is no longer there. But of course, a commercial viability, this is the horrific aspect of commercial viability on the things that we create. But those things also exist. Those things also are explored. Sadly, actually, this collective was killed by the commercial viability. But let's hope there are new coming in this place. So we've got the life and the death, the most basic things that operate in terms of war, the most two basic narrative bits that make on the low level the story of war tick. And as we see, the death is just a symbolic death inside of the game space. Even the game mechanics cannot actually express it, because we find, as humans, the death annoying, which I find an interesting part of our times. But still, war in games is explored very, very strongly. The covers that you see on the left side, no, this is the right side, on this side, that's the solution, it's the Battlefield series. Those are all of the covers of just one single war series, the Battlefield. The one behind me are the Call of Duty series. It's not all of them. And those are only the two very popular first-person shooter franchises that touch upon war. And definitely it's not everything. And the question is, why is that? And there are two aspects that we can look why the war games are so prevalent in our industry, or the game development industry. The first is, when you construct a game, you start with the core component. You start with the player's fantasy. This is something that will drive every decision that you will make during the development process. The player fantasy is how the player should feel. Should he feel, and it has to be quite precise, should the player feel like a knight? Should the player feel like a skater? Should the player feel like a warrior, or etc., etc., etc.? There's a lot of different player fantasies. For example, the fantasy of This War of Mine, if you can call it a fantasy, the underlying principle of This War of Mine is being a civilian during war. This is the player fantasy that guides every single decision. The player fantasy, every single decision during the development. Taking in the account the Frostpunk, in the Frostpunk game, the player fantasy is being a leader in the face of apocalypse. So the question is your humanity worth your survival? In game deck, the player fantasy is being a detective in a cyberpunk world. Those are things that uh, guide the whole game, and if those things change during development, you're screwed very, very deeply. But the thing is, those things that I said before, those player fantasies that are slightly more complex. And when you are trying to tell someone this fantasy, when you try to sadly sell it, it requires a lot more work. But in terms of war, as it's so fundamental to us and to our history, the player fantasy of a soldier, the player fantasy of a war leader, is a one that sells itself, that you don't have to explain. It is there, and this kind of a step is removed from that. And outside of that, we have to ask ourselves why we play games, and why we play games in terms of video games. In this case, but actually, it's broader for all of the games, and of course, there's a lot of different approaches, but usually all of them, from all of the history, comes to the basic things like competency. I hate this word. I hate this word. Autonomy, and relatedness. So playing allows us to create those social connections, but it also gives us a space to make our own decision, which is not always the case, taking into account different groups of people, different social statuses. There are different aspects to all of that, and there's the competency. In the translation of using ludens as play in English seems to be a simplification. As play, as this ludens thing, is also a practice. It's also a ritual. It is broader than the play itself, as in the English word, which is, we know what play. So all of those things can be inside of games. They are the competency, the autonomy, the relatedness. Games build them, and war games do it perfectly well. So the relatedness, taking into account the esport, taking into account the multiplayer character of those games, is quite obvious on the surface and on the deep level. The thing with competency, I know it's a meme, but I think the 360 no scope is the base of all of the competency, and we know that this is the base of playing those war games, getting that skill in shooting, getting that skill in navigating those spaces, and the autonomy of decision making. Again, people who play games are people for very different backgrounds, for their very different ethnicities, socio-economical backgrounds, genders. All of those things may. Yeah, I think the socio-economical now is one of the biggest problems with having an autonomy of any sort. And inside of games, they have this actually illusion, but still choice, still the option to decide who they are, what they do, and why they do it, not burdened by the world around them. So it kind of makes sense that war games are popular, offering all of those needs and space to fill up all of those needs that we have. But there's a trick, because most of games do it. Like, actually, good games do it. It's the purpose of games. But still, war games are one of the most prevailing topics that are out there. They are very played out already, but still they are something very easy, for example, to pitch to a publisher. So why war games? Why not other topics? Uh, Again, in our set, uh, socio-economical climate, in that neoliberal world, everything has to be productive. Everything has to create more value, more money. Everything has to have a purpose different than the ludens and the enjoyment itself. We are no longer making friends, we are networking. We are not longer resting for the sake of rest. We are resting to be more productive. We are no longer reading for the enjoyment of it. It has to have some form of application to what we are doing. We want to be as productive as we want. Of course, I'm talking from a first world perspective. Also, this is a very European, American centric kind of approach to the topic. And so, games may be a futility, just a pastime, something which is not the best thing you can do. You can look down on someone. You have to justify to yourself this action because games destroying your future employees. I get very pissed when I see that title. It is, yeah. But war, this fantasy of war, is a very nice, clear fantasy that can have real life applications. Outside of already the things that you said in your presentation about how games actually translate, the war games translate into actual war skills that can be used by soldiers, playing war games is also a way to prepare, to, especially in the times that we have, to understand, to train, to think about this war conundrum around us. War is serious in nature, so I think war is a very nice cover to put our need to play in disguise, so we don't have to explain what we are doing. We are playing war because this is serious, and it has been like that for many, many years. Chess, where battle simulator, Go, for many years was a tool for the generals to learn and to explore different strategies. And now we do it in different spaces. We do it with our little Warhammer figurines, we do it with armor, we do it with Escape from Tarkov, we do it with Hearts of Iron 4, we do it with platitude of games, but it's still easier to tell your friends, especially taking that to account a masculine perspective, to tell your friends that, yeah, I wasn't out the weekend because I was trying to conquer Nazis with Poland in Hearts of Iron 4. That's also a Polish national sport, trying to do that in Hearts of Iron 4. A historic trauma. But it's still a lot easier to say that and to be perceived as a serious person than saying, oh yes, I was collecting those pocket monsters to then level them up and have the prettiest Pokemon I can have of all of them. That's the serious of the war that we can use to disguise our need to play. Thank you.
You said in the beginning that the strongest motivation is life versus death, which is pretty strong. Uh, but do you see a difference? I think in literature and movies and in games as well, this topic takes a different stance depending on whose death it is.
Of course.
So I find it much easier in real life. I find it much easier to have one's death put on like a heroic action than to sacrifice the life of those who you love. It's always a much harder stance. The hero is often brought into this dilemma, not about sacrificing. You're a hero, you can sacrifice yourself. But would you sacrifice your loved ones, your children, or the life of the citizens of a city? And this, while I think this is not as strong in many games. There are some games based on this, but it's not as strong in many games. Do you see an extension of this, a possibility of extension of this in games, and is there a scale limit to that? In my mind, but I'm too rational, the life of the whole world, of everyone, would be the topmost concern of everyone, but it doesn't seem to work really. I mean, people probably care most about their families than the whole world, which includes their families. So,
yeah, just to reframe your question so I got it correctly. First part is about the motivation of the narrative beat of life and death versus in terms of heroic death and in terms of sacrifice of someone else and how it works. And the second one is the question of scale.
Yeah, if there's a scale limit in
that's-
games,
Yes, there
how
is
can that
4
affect
people.
how we?
So, starting from the second question, this is actually a topic that I battled for 3 years of my life. Because this war of mine, the game about the civilians during war, there's 4 people there. You have 4 characters that you are taking care. Starting with 3, it can be 4 when you have the children. And players empathize with them. This is a lot of, at the moment, empathy when they play, because they know this is Bruno. Bruno brought a lot of food to us. He was good with that. Now the soldier has killed him, so this is me. I was protecting them. I failed. I knew Bruno. Bruno was the character in my game that I liked. And when we started making Frostpunk, Frostpunk is about the survival of society. The smallest number of people that you have in there is 50, and it only goes up from that. So, there's that lovely quote about death of single and death of millions and being a statistic. But of course, we are stubborn people, so I tried quite long and quite strongly to create an empathy and a connection of the player with a single characters, so he cares about individuals, which is a foolish endeavor with that kind of scale, but still trying out to show a singular pieces of their lives. So zooming the story, the focus of the story for a moment on a single character to show how our choices, high level choices, affect them, should bring that scale, should bring that empathy, like with the most, hardcore example. It's not the most hardcore, but for example, in Frostpunk you can introduce a law of radical treatment. So when a citizen gets sick, if it's needed, an emergency amputation may be done. But one of the citizens will say no, they don't want it, they don't want to live with disability, especially in the moment like that, and you can force him to do it or not, and there are consequences. Because if you say yes, there's a chance that this citizen will commit suicide or that he will be thankful. It's a matter of chance. So there's a lot of that kind of stories played out between the high-level decisions, and we hoped for the, at the moment, empathy, and it absolutely did not happen. There was too many people just, not connected stories, but what happened to care. So the players started to care weirdly afterwards. We called it eventually post playthrough reflection. Those stories and those decisions created a cloud of different concepts and ideas in the mind of the player, and after playing the game, those things crystallized in caring for this society, and it affected how the player played it again. But again, that at this moment, caring for all of the people, like actual empathizing with them, I think 10 is the number that you cannot go above. If you want to have the player empathize with bigger groups, there are different tools to do that, and it ain't easy. Have I answered the second part of your question?
More or less.
So
I was thinking about how this affects people in real life. I think a lot of people learn from games, even if they don't know what they learn. They surely learn how to beat the game, obviously. But I'm talking about the role we have.
as education.
Not education, not education. I don't care too much about education. I care about the role of the games as entertainment, but also as a mean of growing. So if there's a point to which people are not interested, I think having a whole civilization at your hands in a game is something you cannot do in real life, most of us. And so could connect us more to the destiny of the whole world, then what happens by checking out the media and I don't think many people
All the
really
other
have an
sources of
idea what's
reality.
going on now. Yeah. What I'm saying is that it could bring us back to reconsider reality
To stay outside
more,
or in the
more than what media and information do.
It already does. It is a term that I like to use is meaningful entertainment, because the games are mediums of expression and can show players on one side a very different experiences, and on the other side allow to play with systems that govern our world, because our world is very hard to understand due to its systemic nature and the interconnectedness of it all. It's hard to understand what is happening, and games give us a space to experiment with that, to understand and to learn and then apply those things. And for example, this War of Mine as this meaningful entertainment, right? It was a very conscious decision. What will be the takeaway of that game? What is the rhetorics of the system in that game? So now, actually, this War of Mine is used as mandatory reading in Polish schools, because it is one thing to read about how it is to be a civilian during war, but this War of Mine is based on the Sarajevo, the siege of Sarajevo. It's different to read it, but when your Bruno dies, it gives you a different context. And this is, of course, on a very low level. This is on the level of a single person. But all of the games, the Hearts of Iron, the Crusader Kings, the Frostpunks, the Hellblade is a great example of that. All of them are, in my opinion, very strong, meaningful entertainment that have strong takeaways for the people that take them outside. And as far as we know, and as far as we collect the data, it works. It adds something new to the people tool belts to walk, to walk through the world. So it doesn't have to be only armor and shooting, it can be more complex things. But of course, the system that we are living here, it's still this meaningful, still has to be entertainment. Because one thing is having the funds to create those games, but also the second thing is approaching as many people as you can. So those people can see your message, can agree with that or don't agree with that, but at least have that kind of discussion. And actually, just finishing up, I know, Fabio, that we don't have time.
Yes.
Just a final thought.
Yeah. Wow.
Just finishing this thing up. I think now it's getting more and more excited in terms of treating games as medium of expression, because more and more games are discussed in terms of the cultural impact, to look on The Last of Us 2, and not in terms of the technical proficiency as, oh, I don't like the colliders going through walls. So I think this is, outside of the nuclear disaster and global warming, which which will kill us all, we have a very interesting and exciting future for games as a strong cultural force. Yes, I'm very sorry.
Thank
Goodbye.
you very much.